This is not a passive entertainment video. It is a study. If you are ready to question your own biases today, leave your like as a sign that your mind is open. Let's begin. Imagine for a moment that you have purchased the most advanced supercomputer in the world. It has unlimited processing power, automatic thermal regulation, and impenetrable security systems. But for some reason, you decide to use only the basic calculator on this computer. You ignore access to the cloud, ignore the design software, ignore the global connection capability. Over time, this machine begins to fail. The system overheats. Processing errors accumulate. The screen freezes. You blame the machine. You say it's defective. But the truth is, you never read the instruction manual on how to connect this machine to its main power source or how to update its operating system. The human brain is that machine. And prayer, stripped of dogma, empty rituals, or religious guilt, is the update software that our biology requires to function at its maximum capacity. Welcome. If you clicked on this content, you probably fit into a very specific category of people. You may consider yourself an intellectual seeker. Perhaps you have distanced yourself from organized religion because it seemed too emotional, full of human rules that made no logical sense. Or maybe you are an agnostic, someone who loves science, loves rationality, but feels deep down a void that no theory of quantum physics has been able to fill so far. You feel that there is something more, but you don't want to turn off your brain to believe it. The good news is, you don't have to. We live in an age of false dichotomies. We've been told we must choose between faith and reason, between the laboratory and the altar, between the neuron and the spirit. But that's a modern lie. Over the past 2 decades, a fascinating and controversial field of study called neurotheology has emerged. Scientists from institutions such as the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard began doing something unusual. They put Buddhist monks and Sufi mystics inside MRI and CT scanners. They wanted to know what happens in the brain when a human being speaks to the divine. Many skeptics expected to discover that prayer was just a form of self-delusion, a comforting delusion for weak minds. But what the brain images revealed shocked the scientific community and forever changed the way we understand mental health. They discovered that the human brain has specific wiring for transcendence. When you pray Anterior, I want you to suspend any preconceptions you may have about holding hands or kneeling on the floor. Brain enters a state of functioning unlike any other human activity. It is not sleep. It is not just relaxation. It is not conversation. It is a unique metabolic state that alters your blood chemistry, modifies the physical structure of your gray matter, and recalibrates how you perceive reality. Studies show that 12 minutes of focused prayer per day for 8 weeks can alter the structure of your prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for logic, focus, and compassion. Prayer, biologically speaking, is a weight training exercise for the most evolved part of your brain. On the other hand, the absence of this practice, or the practice of a spirituality based on fear and guilt, deteriorates the brain. What we are about to explore on this long journey is not an attempt to convert you to a religion. We are not here to sell salvation in the traditional theological sense. We are here to talk about mental clarity and spiritual validation. You will understand why, evolutionarily, human beings developed the ability to pray. Let's dive into the anatomy of belief. We will dissect the parietal lobe and understand how prayer turns off your ego and dissolves existential loneliness. We will analyze the Anterior Cingulate Cortex and discover why prayer is the most powerful antidote to modern anxiety and depression. This is a deep dive. We're not going to stay on the surface of quick self-help advice. We're going to build a solid argument, brick by brick, study by study. If you've always found the church too emotional and science too cold, you've just found your place. Here, we're going to warm up science with purpose and cool down religion with facts. The question isn't, does God exist? That's a question for theologians. The question we'll ask here is, why does your brain act as if he does? And more importantly, what happens to your mind, your anxiety, and your life when you start using this technology to your advantage? Get ready. We're really going to open the black box of the human mind and rediscover the oldest technology in the world. The connection with the sacred, to understand why prayer is not merely a psychological crutch, but a biological necessity. we must first open the hood of the machine. We need to look at the hardware. For centuries, philosophers debated whether God existed out there, in the cosmos, or in here, in the mind. But for a neuroscientist, that distinction is initially irrelevant. Why? Because for you to experience anything in a cup of coffee, the face of your mother, or the presence of the divine in your brain must process it. If your brain doesn't fire the right neurons, that thing does not exist for you. So, the first question we must answer is not, is God real? The scientific question is, does the human brain have a specific circuit to interact with God? The answer is yes, and the implications of this are terrifyingly magnificent. Let's travel back to the late 90s, to the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Andrew Newberg, a pioneer in the field of neurotheology, decided to do something radical. He invited Franciscan nuns and Tibetan Buddhist monks to his laboratory. The experiment was simple yet profound. He asked them to enter their deepest state of prayer or meditation. He tied a string to their fingers. He told them, when you reach the peak of your spiritual connection, that moment where you feel the breakthrough, pull the string. When the string was pulled, Newberg injected a radioactive dye into their bloodstream. This dye migrated to the parts of the brain that were most active at that exact moment, lighting them up on a SPECT single photon emission computer tomography scan. What Newberg found destroyed the argument that prayer is just zoning out or a passive activity. The scan showed that during focused prayer, the brain is not resting. It is engaging in a high-intensity cognitive workout. Specifically, the frontal lobe, the area just behind your forehead, lit up like a Christmas tree. This is the first piece of the puzzle you need to understand. The prefrontal cortex is the CEO of your brain. It is responsible for focus, intention, logic, planning, and willpower. It is what makes us human. It distinguishes us from reptiles and lower mammals. When you sit down to solve a complex mathematical equation, your prefrontal cortex is active. When you are writing a difficult email, it is active. And when you pray with intention, it becomes hyperactive. What does this mean for the intellectual seeker? It means that prayer is an act of attention. In our modern world, our attention is fragmented. We are constantly distracted by notifications, short videos, and multitasking. This weakens the prefrontal cortex. A weak frontal lobe leads to impulsivity, lack of emotional control, and a feeling of brain fog. When you engage in focused prayer talking to a higher power, articulating your thoughts, focusing your mind on a single concept like gratitude or God, you are essentially taking your brain to the gym. You are isolating the muscle of attention, working it out until failure. This is why, after a session of deep prayer, you often feel a sense of mental clarity. It's not just spiritual peace, it is biological focus. You have just synchronized your neural firing patterns. You have quieted the noise. But activity in the frontal lobe isn't enough to explain the spiritual experience. After all, doing a crossword puzzle also activates the frontal lobe. Why does prayer feel ... different? Why does it feel real? Here enters a small, walnut-sized structure deep in the center of your brain called the thalamus. The thalamus is the relay station for all your senses except smell. Everything you see, hear, and touch goes to the thalamus first. The thalamus then decides, is this real information or is this just noise? If the thalamus says it's real, it sends that data to the rest of the brain to be processed as reality. Here is the crucial discovery. When you pray intensely and consistently, the thalamus becomes highly active. This gives us a massive clue about the nature of faith. For the seasoned person of prayer, God is not an abstract concept or a theory. To their brain, God is as real as the chair they are sitting on. The thalamus has stamped that spiritual interaction with the label of objective reality. This is why you cannot argue a believer out of their faith using simple logic. You are trying to use software words to change hardware that their brain processes the spiritual presence as a sensory fact. For the agnostic or the intellectual seeker who struggles to feel anything when they try to pray, the science suggests that this is simply a matter of underused neural pathways. Your thalamus hasn't been trained to recognize that frequency yet. It's like trying to hear a radio station, but your dial is slightly off. The signal is there, but your receiver isn't tuned. This brings us to the most empowering concept in modern neuroscience. For a long time, we thought the adult brain was fixed. We thought you were born with a certain number of neurons, and that was it. We were wrong. The brain is plastic. It is malleable. It changes shape based on what you do with it. There is a famous axiom in neuroscience attributed to Donald Hibb: neurons that fire together, wire together. If you constantly worry, you are wiring your brain for anxiety. You are building superhighways for stress. Your neurons become very efficient at processing fear. If you constantly complain, you are physically building a brain that is excellent at finding faults in reality. But the reverse is true. If you engage in prayer, specifically prayer focused on gratitude, love, and connection, you are building new neural infrastructure. You are physically thickening the gray matter in your prefrontal cortex. Studies have shown that long-term meditators and people of prayer have significantly thicker cerebral cortexes than non-practitioners. They literally have more brain in the areas that control emotional intelligence and compassion. This explains why the chosen one, the person who walks this path of spiritual discipline often, seems to have a resilience that others lack. It's not magic. They have physically engineered a brain that is resistant to despair. However, before we move forward, we must address a critical nuance. This is where we separate science-based spirituality from blind religious tradition. Not all prayer creates the same result. Dr. Newberg and his colleague, Mark Robert Waldman, found something disturbing. While prayer focused on love and compassion strengthens the frontal lobe, prayer focused on fear, anger, or hatred actually damages the brain. If your concept of God is a punitive, angry tyrant who is waiting to crush you, if your prayer is merely a repetitive begging not to be hurt, or if your religious practice is focused on judging others, us versus them, you are not activating the frontal lobe. You are activating the limbic system, the primal, ancient emotional brain. Specifically, you are stimulating the amygdala, the fear center. Chronic stimulation of the amygdala floods your body with cortisol, the stress hormone. This kills neurons in the hippocampus memory center and shuts down the prefrontal cortex. Literally, worshipping a monster god makes you dumber and sicker. This validates the feeling many of you have: the Christians without a church, the ones who left toxic religious environments because they felt sick inside. Your intuition was biologically correct. That environment was keeping your brain in a state of survival, not growth. The intellectual seeker is looking for a connection that expands consciousness, not one that contracts it into fear. So, the hardware is ready. We know the frontal lobe and the thalamus are the key players. But what happens when we push this system to its limit? What happens when the brain decides to shut down the boundaries of the self? To understand this, we must travel to the back of the brain to the parietal lobe and explore the neuroscience of how we lose our ego to find something greater. We have established that the frontal lobe is the engine of attention. Now, we must turn our gaze to the engine of identity. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself, how do I know where I end and the rest of the world begins? It seems like a silly question. You know that your hand is yours and the table is not. You know that you are inside your skin, distinct from the person standing next to you. But this sense of physical separation is not a given fact of reality. It is a complex neurological calculation performed every millisecond by a specific part of your brain. This is the domain of the parietal lobe, specifically a region known as the orientation association area. Think of the orientation association area as your brain's internal GPS. Its sole job is to create a 3D model of your body in space. It constantly draws a line. Everything inside this boundary is you. Everything outside this boundary is not you. This distinction is crucial for survival. If a lion is chasing you, you need to know exactly where your legs are and where the ground is so you can run. This area creates the feeling of being a distinct, separate, solitary individual. It creates the ego. But here is where the science of prayer dismantles our perception of reality. When Dr. Andrew Newberg analyzed the brain scans of subjects in deep prayer or transcendental states, he expected to see activity everywhere. But when he looked at the parietal lobe, he saw something shocking. It went dark. Instead of lighting up with red and yellow, indicating high blood flow and metabolic activity, the orientation association area turned cool, blue, and green. What does this mean? It means that during deep, focused prayer, you are blocking the sensory flow to the parietal lobe. You are essentially starving the GPS of data. When the OA stops receiving information, it can no longer draw the line between you and not you. It tries to find the boundary of the self, but it can't. The calculation fails. And when the brain cannot find the boundary of the self, it has only one default conclusion. The boundary does not exist. In that moment of neural silence, the brain perceives that you are everything, and everything is you. The separation between the subject, person praying, and the object God, the universe collapses. Biologically, this is the sensation of oneness. Theologically, this is union with the divine. For the intellectual seeker, this is a massive validation. The mystics, the saints, and the chosen ones throughout history who described feeling one with the Father or dissolved in the ocean of spirit were not speaking metaphorically. They were describing a distinct neurological event. They had successfully deactivated their orientation association area. This is why they chosen one walks alone but is never truly lonely. Let's unpack this paradox. In your normal day-to-day waking state, your parietal lobe is firing on all cylinders. You are painfully aware of your separation. You look at others and see strangers. You look at the world and see threats. This hyper-individualism is the root of human loneliness. It is the biological cage of the ego. However, the person who cultivates a life of prayer has the ability to exit this cage. When you enter that state of prayer and your parietal lobe goes quiet, the feeling of isolation vanishes because the entity that feels isolated, the ego, has temporarily ceased to function as a separate unit. This is the neuroscience of peace. It is not just an emotion. It is a suspension of the conflict between the self and the world. It is a return to a state of wholeness that we usually only experience in the womb before the OA started drawing lines. For the skeptic, this might sound like a hallucination. Just because your brain turns off the GPS doesn't mean you are actually one with the universe, they might say. But consider this. Is the separation the illusion? Physics tells us that at the quantum level, there are no solid boundaries. We are all made of the same vibrating energy fields. We are constantly exchanging atoms with the air and the environment. The solid wall between you and me is a construct of our senses, not a fundamental truth of the universe. So, when the parietal lobe shuts down, perhaps it isn't creating a delusion. Perhaps it is revealing the truth. Maybe it is finally allowing us to see reality as it actually is, fluid and unified without the artificial filter of the ego. Prayer, then, is not an escape from reality. It is an escape into reality. Why does your brain need this? Why is this essential for mental health? Because the human brain was not designed to carry the weight of the self 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The burden of being a separate, competitive, isolated individual is metabolically expensive and psychologically exhausting. We are seeing an epidemic of anxiety and depression today precisely because we have lost the technology to turn off the parietal lobe. We are stuck in the me versus the world mode. We are trapped in the GPS coordinates of our own problems. Prayer is the biological off switch. It gives your ego a break. It allows your system to reset by plugging back into the source code of existence. If you don't use this switch, you burn out. The chosen one survives the desert not because they are tougher, but because they know how to dissolve the self that suffers. But dissolving the ego is only half the battle. Once we have cleared the noise and silenced the self, we need to deal with the emotions that remain. We need to look at how prayer acts as the ultimate regulator of our emotional core. We must descend into the cingulate cortex and the amygdala. We have explored how prayer sharpens focused frontal lobe and dissolves the ego parietal lobe. But there is a messy middle ground we haven't touched yet: emotions. For the intellectual seeker, emotions are often viewed as a nuisance bug in the system that interferes with logic. You might think, I don't need to pray. I just need to think my way out of this problem. But here lies the trap. You cannot think your way out of an emotional hijack. You need a different mechanism to bridge the gap between your primal feelings and your rational mind. That bridge is called the Anterior Cingulate Cortex, ACC. The ACC is a unique structure shaped like a collar, located deep in the center of the brain, wrapping around the corpus callosum. Neuroscientists often call it the heart of the brain because it sits precisely at the intersection of the limbic system, emotions, and the prefrontal cortex, logic. Its job is conflict monitoring and social awareness. It governs empathy, compassion, and the ability to regulate intense feelings. Here is the data. Dr. Newberg scans revealed that sustained, compassionate prayer stimulates the anterior cingulate cortex. Why does this matter? When your ACC is weak or underactive, you become stuck. You get locked into negative thought loops. You obsess over past mistakes. You lack empathy for others and for yourself. You become rigid. But when you engage in prayer specifically, prayer that focuses on benevolence, forgiveness, or surrender, you are literally exercising the ACC. You are increasing blood flow to this specific bridge. This explains why prayer is the ultimate NZ. It is not magic. It is emotional regulation. By activating the ACC, you are giving your brain the power to say to the amygdala, the fear center, I hear you. I feel the fear, but we are going to choose a different response. This brings us to a critical, often misunderstood aspect of prayer. The use of language. Many intellectual people ask, if God is omniscient, why do I need to tell him what I need? He already knows. From a neuroscientific perspective, you don't pray to inform God. You pray to inform your brain. In psychology, there is a concept called affect labeling. When you experience a vague, undefined anxiety, your amygdala goes crazy. It's like a fire alarm ringing without knowing where the fire is. But the moment you put that feeling into words, the moment you articulate it, you engage the Broca's area language production and the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. Research from UCLA shows that simply naming an emotion reduces the activity in the amygdala. When you pray, whether out loud or silently in structured senses, you are taking the chaotic, nebulous noise of your suffering and forcing it through the filter of language logos. You are giving it structure. You are turning terror into a problem to be solved. This is why the Judeo-Christian tradition places so much emphasis on the word "in the beginning was the word." Order comes from articulation. If you just meditate on your problems without structure, you often end up ruminating. You spin in circles. But prayer implies a conversation. It implies a thou. It forces you to externalize the problem. This process triggers metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking. When you bring a problem to God in prayer, you are essentially stepping out of the first-person perspective, experiencing the pain, into a third-person perspective, observing the pain in the presence of a higher power. You are saying, here is this situation. It is heavy. I am looking at it with you. This creates cognitive distance. It allows the prefrontal cortex to analyze the situation objectively without being drowning in the emotional flood of the moment. In many ways, prayer functions like the ultimate cognitive behavioral therapy CBT session. CBT asks, is this thought true? Is it helpful? Prayer asks, is this fear consistent with the nature of God truth? Is this burden mine to carry? Both mechanisms achieve the same biological result. They de-escalate the stress response and restore executive function. Finally, we must address the most difficult part of prayer for the intellectual seeker: surrender. We love control. We love to predict outcomes. To say that will be done feels like defeat. It feels like giving up. But your brain disagrees. Holding on to control when you have none is a biological hazard. It keeps your sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, chronically activated. Your body is constantly preparing for a battle. It cannot fight because the enemy is the future, or the past, or circumstances beyond your reach. The act of surrender in prayer, the conscious decision to release the outcome to a higher power, is a physiological signal. It tells the brain, the battle is over. You can stand down. This triggers the parasympathetic nervous system. Your heart rate drops, your blood pressure lowers, your digestion and most importantly, your cortisol levels plummet. Surrender is not weakness. It is a strategic conservation of energy. It releases the brain from the impossible task of playing God, trying to control the universe, and allows it to return to its proper function, navigating the present moment with clarity. The chosen one walks alone because they have learned that their stability does not come from controlling the crowd, but from this internal regulated connection with the divine. They have a calibrated anterior cingulate cortex that allows them to feel deeply without being destroyed by those feelings. But what happens when you do this every day? What happens when this becomes a habit? You start to rewrite the physical structure of your brain. You start to change your baseline. We are now ready to discuss neuroplasticity and how prayer can permanently delete the poverty mindset or the trauma loops from your mind. If you take only one thing from this entire presentation, let it be this: your brain is not a static object. It is a process. For decades, science told us that once you reached adulthood, your brain was set in concrete. If you were an anxious person, you would always be anxious. If you were depressive, that was just your chemistry. We were wrong. The field of neuroplasticity has proven that the brain is more like wet clay than concrete. It is constantly reshaping itself based on what you pay attention to. The fundamental rule of neuroscience, coined by Donald Hebb in 1949, is simple. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Imagine your brain is a dense forest. If you walk the same path through the woods every single day, the grass gets trampled, the bushes get cleared. Eventually, that dirt path becomes a paved road. It becomes the path of least resistance. Your brain will naturally choose that road because it is fast and easy. Now, look at your current mental habits. If you spend 10 years worrying, stressing, and expecting the worst, you have built a superhighway of anxiety in your brain. Your neurons are incredibly efficient at processing fear. You don't even have to try to be anxious anymore. Your brain does it on autopilot because that is the road it knows best. This is where the intellectual seeker often gets stuck. You analyze your trauma. You understand why you are sad, but understanding the forest doesn't clear a new path. Only walking clears a new path. Prayer is the tool we use to build a new highway. When you engage in a daily practice of gratitude or focused connection with the divine, you are forcing your brain to walk a path it has ignored. At first, it is difficult. It feels fake. It feels like you are hacking through a jungle with a machete. Your brain resists. It wants to go back to the highway of anxiety because it's easier. But here is the science. Every time you interrupt the negative thought loop and choose a prayer of gratitude or trust, you are physically weakening the old connection. This is called long-term depression of synapses and strengthening the new one, long-term potentiation. Why is this so hard? Because of evolution. Your brain has a negativity bias. Neuropsychologist Rick Hansen famously said, "The brain is like Velcro for negative experiences and Teflon for positive ones." To survive in the wild, your ancestors needed to remember the one time they saw a tiger, not the 1,000 times they saw a beautiful sunset. Fear kept them alive. Happiness was a luxury. But you are not running from tigers anymore. You are running from emails, debt, and loneliness. The survival mechanism that saved your ancestors is now destroying your mental health. Prayer is the counter-evolutionary act. When you pray specifically, when you practice gratitude, you trigger the release of dopamine, the reward neurotransmitter, and serotonin, the mood regulator. But unlike a drug that gives you a temporary high, prayer changes the receptor density in the brain. If you spend 5 minutes every morning thanking God or the universe for what you have, you are not just being nice. You are training your reticular activating system RAS to scan the world for evidence of good. You are teaching your brain to hunt for blessings instead of threats. Remember the game Tetris? Studies showed that people who played Tetris for hours started seeing falling blocks in their dreams and in the real world. Their brains got stuck in Tetris mode. Prayer creates a spiritual Tetris effect. If you consistently saturate your mind with concepts of order, love, purpose, and eternity, your brain starts to pattern match reality to those concepts. Where you once saw chaos, you start to see lessons. Where you once saw rejection, you start to see redirection. Where you once saw loneliness, you start to see solitude. This is not delusion. This is cognitive reframing, powered by neuroplasticity. This brings us back to the concept of the chosen one. Why do they walk alone? Perhaps it is because they are in the middle of a massive construction project. They are tearing down the old highways of social validation, fear, and groupthink. They are paving a new road directly to the source. This construction requires focus, it requires silence, it requires quarantine. But the result is a brain that is literally wired differently from the general population. A brain that is resilient, a brain that produces its own peace, regardless of external circumstances. You are not broken because you don't fit in. You are a prototype of a new way of being. But a prototype must be tested. And the test is not just to pray when things are good. The test is to keep the connection open when the sky is silent. We are now ready to conclude. We must synthesize all these biological facts into a final, coherent philosophy of action. We have reached the end of our investigation. We started this journey with a question. Why does the intellectual seeker, the person who values logic, reason, and truth, need prayer? We didn't answer with scripture. We answered with anatomy. We looked at the frontal lobe and saw that prayer is the ultimate attention training. We looked at the parietal lobe and discovered that spiritual connection is the biological cure for the illusion of separation. We looked at the Anterior Cingulate Cortex and found the switch for emotional regulation. We looked at neuroplasticity and proved that hope is a physical structure you can build. The verdict of the hardware is clear. The human brain was designed to pray. To operate this machine without connecting it to the transcendent is like buying a Ferrari and driving it only in first gear. You can do it, it will move. But you are burning out the engine, and you are missing the point of the design. For a long time, we thought evolution was just about physical survival, as the sharpest claws or the fastest legs. But we have entered a new phase of human history. The next step of evolution is not physical. It is cognitive and spiritual. The survival of the fittest now belongs to those who can regulate their internal world in the middle of external chaos. The people who will lead the future of innovators, the peacemakers, the chosen ones, will not be the ones who can shout the loudest. They will be the ones who have access to the cloud. They will be the ones who can download wisdom, patience, and strategy from a source that is higher than their own panic. I know the resistance you feel. If you are an intellectual, your pride is your biggest barrier. You are terrified of looking foolish. You are terrified of talking to the ceiling. You are afraid that if you surrender, you lose your edge. But let me ask you, is it intelligent to ignore a tool that lowers your cortisol, increases your gray matter, and connects you to a sense of purpose? Or is it simply arrogance disguised as skepticism? True intelligence is open-mindedness. True science is the willingness to test a hypothesis. So, here is my challenge to you. Do not take my word for it. Do not take the MRI scan's word for it. Test it on the only machine that matters, your own mind. For the next 7 days, treat prayer not as a religious duty, but as a neural protocol. Find the silence. Isolate yourself for 10 minutes. No phone. No distractions. Deactivate the ego. Close your eyes to cut off visual data to the parietal lobe. Activate the frontal lobe. Focus your intent. Do not ramble, speak with precision. Use language. Verbalize your gratitude. Verbalize your fears. Externalize the noise. Execute surrender. End by consciously releasing the outcome. Feel the physical drop in tension. If you do this for 7 days, you will not just feel better. You will think clearer. You will notice that the noise of the world affects you less. You will walk through the crowd, perhaps still alone, but no longer lonely. You will realize that the God you were looking for was not a fairy tale for children. He was the missing piece of your own operating system. The hardware is ready. The software is free. The only thing missing ... is the user. Start the download. I'm curious, have you ever felt a physical shift in your body during prayer or deep meditation? A sudden drop in anxiety? Let me know in the comments below. I want to read your data points and subscribe to Divine Neuro. The code is vast and we are just getting started. Thank you.